Today's meeting is about idols of the mind versus true reality, a book by Dr. Immanuel Puri of the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute. Before we get to the topic of the book, we're going to demonstrate its relevance to what's going on in science right now. Richard Dawkins is an evolutionary biologist and was the professor for public understanding of science at Oxford University from 1995 to 2008. He is most famous for his books such as The Selfish Gene, 1976, and The God Delusion, 2006. He also coined the term meme, which refers to cultural parallels with biological genes, such that both genes and memes transmit information or evolve over time. So here are some memes with Richard Dawkins as a joke. Introduces the concept of memes into the scientific world. He became a meme himself. And here's some videos. Dawkins is committed to a reductionist, gene-centric view of all biological phenomena, rejects the existence of free will, and uses his scientific biases to criticize religion and deny the existence of God.
The coded information is potentially immortal. And that means that the difference between a successful gene and an unsuccessful gene really matters. It's going to matter for millions of years. So the genes that make it through those millions of years are the ones that are good at it. And good at it means good at building bodies, good at controlling the processes of embryology, to make bodies which have what it takes to preserve those genes and pass them on. And so I use this phrase survival machine. A body, an individual, is a survival machine. And that's by far the most powerful way of interpreting what an individual organism is. An individual organism is a throwaway survival machine for the self-replicating coded information which it contains.
So here you can see his idea of an organism, which is himself, right? He is an organism. An organism is a throwaway body for the information in the genes to pass on to the next generation. So his entire conception of what an organism is completely reduces to the function of genes transmitting information.
I have a question. So if he's an organism that's just getting thrown away, is our jobs, even though we don't have free will according to him, to one day there will be a person who becomes enlightened because we're just passing on that information throughout time?
Now he's making a lot of assumptions that the entire trajectory of evolution is simply, for any organism, whether it's a human or a monkey or a fish or a single-celled organism, is simply to pass on its information to the next generation. So it means the value of a person's goals in life or fulfillment, all this is nonsense. It actually doesn't exist from this point of view, from this worldview. The only thing that really exists in a permanent way is the transfer of information from one generation to the next. Everything else is kind of imaginary and nonsensical. We're not subscribing to this ourselves. We're just giving it as, he's very famous for presenting this kind of view. This kind of view is held by many people in the public, and this sets up Dr. Dawkins-Noble, who is a contemporary of Richard Dawkins, and who presents a very different idea. So this is kind of just giving the polar distinction to what's going to be presented next.
Explaining earlier when I first walked in. Okay.
Yeah. So your question was, will eventually the transfer of genetic information make someone who is enlightened?
Well, maybe not enlightened, but I guess as the information gets passed on, does the information grow, which us as humans or single cell or whatever you may be, your intelligence grows?
His idea of information is completely limited to the kind of information a genome can contain.
Okay.
So a genome, the kind of knowledge that you have as a human being, it's a very different level of knowledge, of information than what's in the genome. The genome is essentially information on the characteristics of your body, right? And then the expression of that as embryonic development occurs. It's, from his view, that's all determined by what's in the genome. The kind of knowledge that a mature human being has is a very different kind of information that isn't something which is passed on through the genome from generation to generation, but rather is only passed to the next generation through education, which is a completely subjective endeavor. A teacher has to talk to a student who is receptive, right?
Yeah, of course.
So it's a different kind of thing. No, right now the camera is only getting that. Do you have any problem with me putting it down so we can...
Let's not do that.
So, now we'll hear Richard Dawkins say something about free will.
But it wasn't only kin that inspired me, it was the very idea of the survival machine of immortal genes, which goes back to the 1930s. When I think I have free will, when I think that I'm exercising free choice, I'm deluding myself, that my brain states are determined by physical events. And I think that the sort of so-called sophisticated theologians who accept the scientific worldview don't impress me very much, because I don't think they've really thought through the negative impact that has on their religious worldview.
So Richard Dawkins is very much situated in the idea that his perspective of science, I'm not going to even say science in totality because it's only his perspective of science. As you find, there'll be other scientists also practicing empirical science at very sophisticated institutions that have a very different idea of reality than Richard Dawkins. But he is convinced that his perspective of science is so impervious to imperfection that it can completely dismantle all religious ideas, all ideas of free choice in living entities from single cells to learned human beings, and that his duty through his books and his presentations is to teach people about how that perspective is correct and the other perspective is incorrect. And that's troublesome because he is a very popular individual and he influences many, many people. So now we'll hear about Dawkins-Noble, who is also a professor. He's still a professor, emeritus and co-director of computational physiology at Oxford University. His book, The Music of Life, 1992, was groundbreaking for the field of systems biology, and he also developed the first viable mathematical model of the working heart in 1960. Noble's organism-centered approach clarifies the role of specific gene functions in the broader context of an organism's living cognitive activities. He explains that progress in 21st century biology affirms the existence of free will or choice. Following moderating a 2009 debate between evolutionary biologists Lynn Margulis and Richard Dawkins, Dawkins-Noble debated Dawkins in 2022.
Dawkins' selfish gene has been hugely influential, both within evolutionary biology and the wider public sphere. It is a beautiful, simple story that genes and not organisms drive evolutionary change. But critics argue the story is simplistic. The effect of a gene is not always the same and is dependent on its host and the cell environment. Dawkins-Noble, a pioneer of systems biology, goes further, arguing that the organism and not genes are in fact in charge. So Dennis, as you probably already know anyway, is a world-renowned biologist and Professor Emeritus of Cardiovascular Physiology at the University of Oxford. He's famous for developing the first ever mathematical model of cardiac cells in 1960. His most groundbreaking book, The Music of Life, was the first work in the field of systems biology. To my left, of course, is Richard Dawkins, who is a biologist and best-selling author. He's one of the most famous scientists in the world, but you don't need me to tell you that. Anyway, with good reason, his 1976 work, The Selfish Gene, was the first ever real blockbuster popular science book, shaping how we have all understood evolution and where we come from. And since then, of course, he's written numerous other bestsellers, including The Blind Watchmaker, The God Delusion, and Climbing Mount Improbable.
I approached this with some trepidation because Dawkins-Noble was actually my doctoral examiner.
Richard, we're in the chair again.
So I'm somewhat nervous. I hope I pass today. Me, the argument today is about one paragraph in Dennis's excellent book, Dance.
So the reason I included that part of the interview was just to demonstrate that the history of this polarity of ideas is very entrenched in biologists at the top of their fields for a long time, right? They've known each other for a long time, and although this is kind of reaching the public now, or over the last 10 years has kind of reached the public, this has been something that's been going on since the 70s, right? So it's significant.
The Tune of Life, which is a wonderful book, except that it's wrong. The sentence, well, the paragraph concerned is this book will show that there are no genes for anything. Living organisms have functions which use genes to make the molecules they need. Genes are used, they are not active causes. Now, I think that's a wonderful sentence because although it's wrong, it's clear. It's absolutely clear and open and articulate, and that makes my job relatively easy because I want to show that the exact opposite is true. The truth is opposite. Genes use individuals, use organisms as tools for their own propagation. If Dennis is right, then I've been wrong for 50 years, and so have actually most of the people now working in the field. So we put Dennis's genome in a petri dish.
That's right, yes.
And keep it going for 10,000 years. Well, it wouldn't keep going, it would decay, as you rightly say. However, the information, it could be preserved on paper. You could actually write it down in a book. You could carve the A, T, C, and G codons in granite and keep it for 10,000 years. And then in 10,000 years, type it into a sequencing machine, which we already have, and it would recreate an identical twin of Dawkins-Noble.
No, I don't think it would.
You don't think it would?
No.
Why not?
Well, it would need one. It would need an egg cell.
Oh, of course it would. No.
Yeah, yes. I think we need an egg cell.
So the significance of what just happened here is that as an evolutionary biologist, Richard Dawkins overlooks a lot of the factual, empirical details of what actually goes on in the development of an organism. Rather, he is more focused on what he thinks is going on from generation to generation over the span of billions of years, right? Because that's what an evolutionary biologist is concerned with. So just from that point of view, we can already see that what Dawkins is dealing with is actually more abstract and less empirical, because whatever we think we know of evolution over the past 3.8 billion years obviously wasn't all empirically observed. A lot of it is based on the development of conceptions that have happened through history. What Noble is dealing with is what he observes in the lab on a daily basis, what is going on in the body of every single organism present on the earth at this very moment. And what that shows, what Dawkins-Noble is seeing as an individual who is not affected by the biases that more materialistically oriented scientists like Dawkins are kind of affected by, is that, so when I say materialistically afflicted, they assume, because again, they have not proved it for sure, and we can get into that, but it's a different topic, but they assume that life itself is a product of matter. But what Dawkins-Noble is seeing in the lab is that the genome, the matter itself is dependent upon life, that life is fundamental and matter is coming from life. So that the cells themselves, the egg cell in this case, is what's actually using the DNA to then undergo all the biological activity that's necessary to go from an egg cell to an embryo to an organism. Where Dawkins, on the other hand, is saying, no, the only thing you need to do to get another organism is to have its genome, and then you can just put the molecules together and finish. But that's completely abstract from the actual process of embryonic development that exists. And so that's why, so the important thing that happened there was Dawkins left that key detail out. He was just concerned about his presumption that matter is fundamental. All you need is the DNA, and you can make a copy of anybody you want. And Noble was kind of bringing it back to a real, down to earth, a real place where you're saying, actually, what you need is a living cell to have that information, execute the process that needs to be executed to get the organism.
What if you gave that living organism, you gave it the replicated DNA and then replicated all of its life experiences that Dawkins-Noble experienced? Then what do you like?
But what did you start with though?
If you took the cell
Mm-hmm.
and then took the identical genes, like Dawkins was saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And put it in the egg cell, and then replicate everything that Noble experienced throughout life, would you have the same?
Well, so we can.
So I'm in biology, like the biology 1,
Yeah.
and we actually just talked about that.
Okay.
And the professor told me that, or not told the class, that you would have the exact same person if you replicate the life experiences as well as the DNA.
I think it would be almost impossible because
To replicate the life experiences,
because,
yes.
like, how do you?
You can't do that.
You
But
can't unless you have like a closed situation where you could, like, what's that one movie where that guy's like being filmed the whole time?
Truman Show.
Yeah, the Truman Show would be basically that. Thank you.
so what?
But you said though, you started out in the right place though. You said if you have this, the point here is if you have the living cell, which that's what you need to start with. You can't start with the DNA, which is non-living, which is literally inert matter that doesn't do anything on its own unless it's within the context of the living cell, which as a living entity has cognition, has consciousness, uses the tool to do what it wants with the tool. The DNA is just an inert tool. It has information. Like you write, a book has information. But that information only is useful when someone who is conscious can read the information and act on it. Otherwise, the book isn't going to do anything. You can have all the information you want in the book. Unless you have someone who reads it and acts on the information, that's when it's useful. That's when it's really the thing. So speculation about like what if this and that, I mean, unless they do the experiment and show it, then they can say it can happen. So it's just kind of, in my perspective, it's kind of useless to like speculate like that. But as long as you're saying, or you're starting with the cell, the living entity, then at least we have some ground. That's appropriate. You have to start with the living cognitive entity. And the thing is, as much sense as it seems to make, right? It seems like pretty straightforward. Like a lot of people somehow like miss that point, and they, like this guy, like they don't. The fact that something contains information, but it needs a living cognitive entity to read that information and to utilize it. Like that is a very difficult point, and many people, many scientists don't think in those terms, which is very odd, you know? So like as someone else who's just kind of finding out about this over the last few years myself, like that's really confusing. Why is that the case? Why isn't that common sense? But addressing those points comes later in the book, where you get into the presumptions that many scientists, not most, because there's a lot of changes happening, but you get into the presumptions that underlie the work that's been done and that serve to ossify the current idea of what science is. It's a lot of based on unjustified presumptions.
Except for, like, I guess laws of nature at that point. Like, it's not matter, but it is a law.
It's a law, but this is actually part of the presentation. So there's different kinds of objects in nature. Some of them are a mechanical object like this. Some of them are a living object like this. Gravity is working 100% on this. It's also working on me, but I can stand up. I can oppose the gravity. Thermodynamics is making this decay. But a living entity, there's something called, thermodynamics means entropy, right? Heat death.
Yeah.
There's something called negentropy in living entities, where not only there's a deterioration, but then there's a building back up. This is the metabolic process. You have anabolism, which is a building up, catabolism, which is that entropy, which is that death, which all mechanical objects are experiencing without a building back up. The living entities are continually renewing
Because we have cells.
because we're alive. And it gets into the digestive process. We're taking things, and we're going to get into all this, we're taking things that aren't ourselves, a nice banana, which is a different living entity apart from me, but I'm taking this banana, and then I'm turning it into myself. I'm eating the banana, and it's breaking down through the digestive process. It's becoming me. No longer it's a banana, now it's broken down into its base nutrients, and the
Some
cells...
would argue it's still a banana, but that's a whole other talk. I wouldn't argue that, but some would argue that it's still a banana.
And that means right now I'm a banana, because, you know, then I'm a banana, because bananas help to make my, you know, my body.
What was the other word that you used that was like entropy, but it's not?
Negentropy.
So, is there a balance between the two in
Yeah.
living things?
I mean, eventually,
Like,
still...
does one have hierarchy over the other?
Yeah, death still occurs, right? So death still occurs. But the fact that there is a resistance to that process, such that there's a building back up, that is very telling of the fact that there are different kinds of bodies in nature. There's mechanical bodies and a living body, organic body. And that distinction is like a key observation that is also not readily accepted. Everything is a mechanical body to dominant science. You, me, the water bottle, the chair, we're all mechanical bodies, period, end of statement. And that gets you into all the things of no free will,
Yeah.
the whole thing. But clearly that's not the case, right? Mechanical bodies, the laws of nature, which is what you brought up, are acting 100% with zero resistance on all mechanical bodies. That's clearly not the case with a living entity. They're conscious, because consciousness plays a role here. If a person or an entity is not conscious, then they're just a limp body on the ground. Gravity is acting 100%.
You have to be careful about using living entities, because that word specifically saying it's conscious, because like a tree is living.
Yeah.
But a tree can grow without knowing that it's growing.
Well, I mean, studies show that trees are also cognitive. They communicate with each other.
They do communicate. There's the mother tree and so on and so forth.
No, even they send messages like when threats are coming, like although obviously they can't move in the sense that other animals move, there's a whole network through the roots that they communicate with each other. And they show that even plants experience pain. And they can show that based on electrical reactions when they injure the tree. So when we say living, and we've talked to scientists who even show that even on the single cell level, right? When we say living, we mean from a single cell to the most complex organism, including all plants, all animals, all fungi, all the kingdoms of life.
I would love to get into the whole they feel pain thing some other time because like pain is almost subjective. So how do you measure that?
It means, right, so I mean, we'd have to look at the whole study, and you're right, it's a whole other topic, and I'm not prepared to talk about that.
Yeah,
I guess.
that means neither am I. Right?
But
I'm great at rebuttaling, but I'm not good at having the facts to back up my rebuttal.
But for the purpose of being able to resist the laws of nature, which is what I'm trying to get at here, consciousness is key because when we're not conscious, the body is limp. Gravity, we're not resisting gravity, right? At least there's still, even if we're not conscious, still at least the cells are working. So neck entropy is still happening. So being conscious doesn't necessarily mean being unconscious doesn't mean that all resistance to natural laws is occurring. But the point is that when we're standing up, we're resisting gravity. We need that consciousness to actively decide to stand. And the main point is that living entities and mechanical entities are two categorically different kinds of natural bodies. And the fact that science doesn't acknowledge that right now, and hasn't acknowledged it since basically, Descartes,
Free will.
Everything associated with it. It's a big deal, and it affects medicine, it affects ecology, so that's why we're trying to talk about this. That's right, it's relevant. The nuances are infinite, no doubt.
Yeah, of course.
But so we don't want to get caught in the nuances right now. We just kind of want to give the presentation of why it's relevant, what a useful way to think about it is, and then if someone can accept that much, then the nuances can be considered and it can be carried out in whatever particular ways people want to move forward with it.
In 10,000 years, they will have the technology to take an egg cell.
Oh, I see. Okay, and I now therefore need to follow up on a different issue then, if I may, Richard. Yes. Because, you see, what you would need to be is a good self-replicator. And you won't be surprised that I disagree with you on self-replication, because I think that's a central feature. Because I think without the self-replicator, I'm not quite sure that I understand what the selfish gene idea really means. Now, what is the accuracy when the cell actually divides and provides two new cells? It's 1 in 10 to the 10. Hardly a single, that's rather...
So here Dawkins-Noble is telling about the cognitive feat of the cell that has to proofread the DNA. So proofreading the DNA means there are errors in that book of DNA. There are errors, like there might be typos in a book. There are errors in that DNA. And the cell, as the cognitive entity, then comes as the editor to fix those errors. And so what he's saying now is giving the statistic for the incredible feat that cell has to do in that proofreading process. Maybe we don't have to listen to the whole video, but the point is that cells themselves are cognitive, and that's essential for the genome understanding.
Proofread the mistakes. And I only know, I mean, that's why I say you'd have to put my genome in 10,000 years, hence, in utterly presumptuous for a physiologist.
So now he's talking about
That's
free
what I
will
am.
and how philosophy
Enter
and
the
science are
utterly
complementary.
philosophical area of free will. So I'll begin by making two bold assertions that I will justify during the talk. The first is that the processes by which living organisms make choices are indeed open to empirical investigation. The relevant questions I will show are empirical, physiological questions as much as they are conceptual, philosophical ones. The second is that these two aspects, the empirical and the conceptual, are necessarily related because we cannot answer empirical scientific questions in a conceptual vacuum. No science can exist in a conceptual vacuum. If activated by the rest of the cell, notice that, it's the living cell that does it. If activated by the rest of the cell,
enables that gene to start informing the ribosomes in the cell to produce the protein necessary for that function. But that's not something that the gene does without being activated from the high-level property of the cell as a whole. So the functionality comes at a different level. It's not at the level of the nucleus. The nucleus is just a membrane that surrounds the DNA and holds the DNA tightly bound together in its chromosomes, usually, and just liberates little bits of it when you need to make more protein. That's all it is. It's the end of story. It is not what creates life. Now, I think for roughly 20 years since the sequencing of the genome, the first sequencing of the human genome in...
So now he's talking about something that happened at the turn of the century, I think between 1991 and 2003. There was something called the Human Genome Project that the United States government funded by billions and billions of dollars to completely sequence the human genome, to get all of the information from it on a computer, basically. And the promises, as they were accomplishing that task, they were making all these big promises based on the presumptions that they had of the role of the genome. They were saying, once we have this, we'll be able to predict every disease that any person will ever have because all that information is in the genome. We'll be able to tell if they're going to have genetic disorders or if they're going to anything.
Are going to have or could have?
No, that they are.
Are going to have.
Because the idea is that the diseases come from mistakes in that genome.
Certain errors mean correlate to certain diseases.
Yeah. But that's not what happened. And he explains that.
So that's false according to this?
According to what he's saying, he has a paper that students at Oxford published that show, because so now that we're living in 2025, after that whole study finished in 2003, so now it's 22 years later, and so they have tests that are called, what are they called? Polygenic risk scores. Like in medicine, you might encounter that, right? Have you encountered that already? Polygenic. So polygenic risk scores are exactly that. They test your genome and they say, oh, this person might have autism. This person might have
based
dementia.
on certain errors, right? Like different codes with the AT and either the CG.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, that test, this polygenic risk score, gives as many false predictions as it does correct ones, which makes it like functionally useless, right? If 50% are correct, 50% are not correct.
Yeah.
Well, this is not a reliable tool for medical science. And the reason is because, as he explains, the functions of the different organs, such as the brain, which is where dementia is rooted, right? It doesn't occur at the level of the genes in the brain. It occurs at the higher levels of organization, at the cellular or tissue levels of organization. So the genes have nothing to do with that. So progress. Yeah.
No. Actually, I don't want to interrupt, but it brings up a really interesting topic.
Okay.
You can keep going, but I'll bring it up later.
Okay. So basically, progress in this direction has now, they accept cells are cognitive, that you can't tell these things from looking at the genome. So it makes them think of diseases like cancer as a communication problem. Because cells are talking to each other to accomplish the healthy state of an organism. And in order to accomplish that, they have to talk to each other and make decisions together and act as collectives.
So basically what you're saying is like cancer, for example, is never genetic. It's always circumstantial.
No, I don't know about never. All I'm saying is that the from the paper that he presented, the polygenic risk scores which try to detect if you have a genetic disorder are half wrong, half right. So using the genome as the place to look for the existence of those diseases, is they're looking in the wrong place. And so when I'm saying something about cancer, is you're saying, is cancer never genetic? No, definitely. I'm not saying that. Can it be passed from one person to another? As far as I understand from normal everyday life, that's how it happens a lot of the time. But they're trying to treat it in a different way, rather than blasting it with radiation because they think it's just like a growth of a tumor. They're saying, well, actually, cancer sometimes starts with what they call a free radical cell, where instead of acting in the collective that the cell exists in, it acts as an individual. And so we'll get into the philosophical implication of this later. But when the cell acts as an individual and it stops cooperating with the collective, it begins to destroy whatever the function is. And when it starts acting as an individual, they're saying, well, actually it seems to really be something like someone in a group on a team sport deciding to plug their ears and start tackling their own teammates. It's a communication problem. You got to take the fingers out of the kid's ear and say, stop tackling your teammates and play the game right. So they basically are doing the same thing with the cell. They're trying to communicate with the cell, get it to stop, not replicating even, but whatever activity it's doing, which I don't know what activity it's doing. But they try to affect the cognition of the cell and cooperate with the collective again. This way the tumor stops growing, so replicating. That's it. So, but the point is that this approach to biology has transformed their approach to trying to cure cancer. I don't know if that is the solution. Of course, I'm not saying something stupid like that. I have no position to say something like that. But it has transformed that aspect of medicine. This is this is showing how promising this kind of approach is. It completely affects every aspect of whatever you think you know about life, including diseases and how different entities interact with each other. So this is what he's describing in this talk to us.
2001, we've all laboured under the illusion, because it is an illusion, that promise will one day be satisfied, that people will find that program in the DNA and show how it works to create the organism. What they've been presented with from that study at University College London that I referred to, just recently published in the British Medical Journal, is that's higher levels of the organism. And we didn't do that. We chose to spend all the money on sequencing as many genomes as possible. And we've ended up with the result that it doesn't tell us what makes us work. What makes us work as organisms is us. It is our cells, our tissues, our organs, and even the organism as a whole. Because remember, I put the sociotype at the top as that or the other. But that's just probably.
Okay. So now transitioning to what the book, if we can go an extra 10 minutes, is that okay with you guys?
Oh yeah, that's
right. So now this is just a summary of the points that Noble was presenting, so that we can see how these are fulfilled to some degree, or at least approached by the book. So the points are, science needs to focus on purposeful behavior of living entities, the capacity for and consequences of choice or decision making, properly discriminating between bottom-up phenomena, where lower levels of organization like molecules or cells affect higher levels like the organism, and top-down phenomena, where the organism determines cellular or molecular activity, and for the complementarity of science and philosophy. So these principles nicely correspond with the work that Dr. Immanuel Puri has been engaged with since the mid-1970s, and as it's introduced in Idols of the Mind versus True Reality.
Was he the guy in that video with you?
He was.
Oh,
Yes,
interesting.
I live with him.
Oh, wow.
So now getting to the actual book. This is just a snippet from a review that our faculty advisor, Jennifer Leik, wrote for the book a couple of years ago when the club started. She said, "This book serves as a useful synopsis of the main arguments for looking beyond materialist science toward a more holistic worldview. Although some readers will find the pace and breadth of Dr. Puri's arguments disorienting, others will appreciate its comprehensiveness and straightforward presentation. In any case, the message is an important one, as materialist philosophy continues to wreak havoc on social relationships and the environment around the world. All right, so now today's presentation is just on chapter 1, which is called The Logic of Life. And in general, the whole chapter emphasizes the teleological view of nature and life through the philosophies of Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, and G.W.F. Hegel. And we have some pictures of them and the years that they lived. So the first part of Aristotle's philosophy that is presented in the book are the 4 aspects of causality: the material, efficient, formal, and final aspects of cause. So basically, these are the 4 aspects that Aristotle says any student of nature should look at when they're trying to understand a natural object. So the material aspect of cause is the object's constitutive stuff. Basically, like a wooden chair is made out of wood. The efficient aspect is the active force shaping an object. Basically, the carpenter shaping the chair.
So it's not the shape of the chair, it's who's shaping the chair?
The active force. Then the shape of the chair is basically the formal, which is the conceptual blueprint or the formative principle of the chair. And then the final aspect of cause, which is teleology. That for the sake of which the object exists, its purpose. Aristotle's ontology, where ontology is the study of being. Well, being means isness to some extent. So it's not only empirical existence, something that exists in front of our senses, but it's also talking about thoughts which aren't empirically observable, but they nonetheless are within the mind. So his ontology gives 3 things that we need to consider. Three states of being, we can say. Dunamis, which is potentiality. This is also Aristotle's word for matter, dunamis. Energia, the actuality. So for him, matter is a potential, which then needs to become something actual, which needs to be shaped. And then there's a process of actualization going from the potential to the actual, called entelechy. And that word entelechy has the word telos in it. It means telos is teleology, purpose, so it's related to that final aspect of cause. And en means in, so it's an inner kind of purpose. And these 3 states of being help us understand natural objects. So on the blackboard there, you have the whole chair with the different aspects of cause. And so we don't have to go over that again. But the point, the takeaway is that the purpose of non-living objects, right, when we're talking about a chair, right, the final cause of a chair is its capacity to support a person sitting. So that purpose depends on an object that's external from the chair, a human, or anything, sitting down on it. So that's not an internal purpose, it's an external purpose. So there's a distinction between inner and outer purpose. So the only kinds of natural objects that have internal purpose are living entities. So that means that the natural object of any kind of organism is trying to survive or is trying to find pleasure. These are internal, subjective ends, right? They're not. Yeah. So there's a difference between inner and outer purpose, and that's a significant observation. So then, the states of being. The first, so this is applying it to embryology. So first, the significant thing here is going from a living entity starts out as protoplasm, or you can say a fertilized egg. And that cell then differentiates, and the different cells specialize into different kinds of tissues and organs until the organism is formed and continues to mature. But that process, the protoplasm is the potentiality, right? Mm-hmm. Because that organism, so in this case a frog, is the end or purpose of that protoplasm. It will become a frog, but it's not a frog yet. So its purpose is the goal, which is directing its development towards that. Now, some people may say, like, can you alter that, basically? Can you do something to the egg to change what it becomes? So they've done experiments with that. And so I have an example here, Hans Dreisch's sea urchins from 1891, and Michael Levin's Picasso tadpoles. He's a current biologist in Boston, and he's kind of leading the charge with these kind of experiments that test the how flexible and how intelligent a developing cell is, such that he will rearrange the face of the would-be tadpole to see if it affects how the frog ends up. And the findings are that, so that kind of circumstance would never happen in nature. It would only happen in the lab, where the face is completely scrambled. And yet, even though it would never encounter that in nature, still the tadpole, in spontaneous ways, the cells are able to reconfigure the face and develop into a normal frog. So that end goal of a frog is like embedded on that immature form of the embryo. And it will reach that goal even if external interference comes and tries to change it. So same thing with Hans Dreisch's sea urchins. We had the blastomeres, which is just a very immature form of the embryonic development. It was one, and they split it into two. So the idea is like, okay, does that mean the sea urchin, will it either kill it and it won't grow, or will it grow like two halves? Instead, each of those two halves became a whole embryo itself and produced two sea urchins. So that development, that final stage of development, is embedded very strongly as a goal that the cell will use its cognitive capacity to overcome unexpected circumstances in the environment to still achieve that goal. So when we say cognition, we're talking about the capacity to have a goal, to reach the goal, to encounter unexpected adversity and overcome that to still reach the goal. These are all things happening in a single cell, developing into a mature organism, right?
I wish you came to our meeting 2 weeks ago on philosophy of goal setting.
Goal
It was
setting.
perfect. It was actually a really cool meeting.
Yeah, so goal setting is happening in unexpected places, you know, not just humans. You have something to say?
I don't know how I want to word it, so we'll keep going.
Okay, so the point of this book, Dr. Puri mentions that the actual process of actualization, going from the potential to the actual, is really not known by scientists. They'll say, the cells are differentiating and specializing. But they won't acknowledge the cognitive capacity of that cell, which is so dynamic, such that it's making decisions, overcoming adversity, how it has the potential to do that, where it got the potential to do that. I mean, those are all questions they don't even ask what to speak about trying to answer. So that leads Dr. Puri to say the actualization process, going from the potential to the actual, simply is not known by modern science. So then he says, so then the book progresses by kind of asking the question, how can we think about, or how can we explain this predisposition to develop in a particular way and not in any other way? And so what Dr. Puri says, this is a quote from the book at the bottom, I think it will be very useful to look at the way Hegel organized the various types of objects that we observe in nature, the mechanical, chemical, and biological, according to what he called the concept, or in German, Begriff. The concept for Hegel is essentially a dynamic or organic unity of the different moments or parts that constitute its content. That's on page 15. So, now this also, Hegel's philosophy is in many ways a response to Immanuel Kant's philosophy, and also develops it and progresses beyond it. And he attributes much to Kant, and he also explains, where his philosophy diverges and kind of fills the gaps. But this doesn't get too much into that. Basically, we just Hegel gives Hegel's ontological distinctions between natural objects. Again, ontology means the study of being, the state of being. So he's saying that there are different kinds of being. There's mechanical, which is categorically different from the chemical, which is categorically different from the biological. And then Kant, Immanuel Kant, we look at his definition of an organism, which is very much complementary to Hegel's presentation of what biology is. And then Hegel goes on with his concept of life, where a concept means it's something very particular in the Hegelian sense, that life is a dialectic process. So what that means, we'll get into. And then, so singular, particular, universal, these are the three moments of the concept that Hegel says, these are the three necessary moments of any concept. And we'll get into what those mean for life in particular and what they mean in a general sense too. And then, so life as a dialectical process, it's a self-maintained process, it's a unity in diversity. It's not just a unity, it's not just a diversity, it's both. So what does that mean? We'll also briefly talk about that. So here is Hegel's ontological distinctions between natural objects. A mechanical object, so a mechanical system is an aggregate whole unified by external agency. So you can think of a clock as a mechanical whole. A clock is constructed from a clockmaker. There's nothing intrinsic to the gears of the clock that make it combine. It's simply externally put together by the engineer. There's no inner necessity in the clock. Their parts, the different gears inside the clock, they retain the same identity whether or not they're in the system. So the gear that's inside the face of the clock is the same exact kind of object that it is if it's on the hat of a steampunk decoration. It's the same exact kind of object. And so these kind of systems are amenable to reductionism because the mechanical whole is simply the aggregate of the parts. The whole is the aggregate of the parts. There's nothing, there's no aspect of the whole which is more than the sum of the parts. It simply is the sum of its parts.
Have you heard, I don't know what this theory is called, but it's like about the letter A. You can write the letter A in so many different ways, like even ways that is so absurd, but you would still know it's the letter A. Like, I wish I had a piece of paper. Can I use your piece of paper? Like, I could write the letter A like this, and you would still kind of understand that what I'm trying to write is the letter A versus like that. Like, the A doesn't matter, it's still the letter
Yeah,
A.
that's the main, so this is a very relevant point. So how the concept can be expressed, a concept, whatever that concept happens to be, if it's the letter A, can be expressed in so many different ways, but the meaning of the concept is the same despite its, so this is unity and diversity, right? That concept, which is the main thing, is the unity of any kind of cursive or symbolic or anything you can do. That's all a diversity, but that diversity is unified by that concept A, which is the same in all of them. So that's super relevant.
You should look it up. I don't know what it's called, but if you start looking up like the concept of the letter A, you could probably find a video.
They do some wacky things, you know, like where they'll write a sentence out in like symbols that kind of look like the letters, where they'll even leave a letter out, and then they just put it like on Facebook or something. And when you look at it, you can still read exactly what the sentence is, even though it's clearly not the letters that actually make up the sentence. So it's some linguistics or something like that. I don't know, but it's interesting. So the chemical, now the thing on the blackboard is showing the relation of these three kinds of natural objects. So the mechanical is just three dots. Their only unity is whatever externally is acting on them. There's no internal relationship between the parts. But now when you see the chemical, you see a line going through the three dots. So it's symbolic of there's a relationship between the three parts. So a chemical system, they're a relational whole. unified through an internal affinity for bonding, right? H2O, the molecules of the hydrogen and the oxygen, they have an affinity to bond with each other due to the polar nature of the chemicals, it's positive or negative, and they bond. So there's some internal relationship there. So it's already categorically different from a mechanical part because, you know, there's no, that kind of bonding doesn't exist. You might say, well, what about a magnet? But the magnets are interesting, but the kind of unities that a chemical product, like you have two gases, hydrogen and oxygen, and produces a liquid. So this kind of unity is a transformative unity. A magnet, nothing transforms when two magnets attract each other, right? They just kind of collide and they stick together. It's not that they collide, stick together, and like become a rubber ball. There's no transformation. But when chemicals bond, they completely change. You have a gas, right? Hydrogen is a gas, oxygen is a gas. When they come together, they become a liquid. They transform.
I don't know much about chemistry, but could I take the H2O and create water, then separate those molecules and it not be water?
You can still separate them.
Okay.
You can still separate. So the unity doesn't persist. So that's why it's still not adequate. It's not as adequate as the unity of a biological whole. Because the parts, hydrogen and oxygen, they have an independent existence away from the water. But they also have a transformative thing. So they're both, the parts are independent as they can exist as different atoms, and they're also dependent such that they transform and become something new. So they're kind of, chemism is kind of like the middle of the road between biological and mechanical. Because in biological systems, now the parts have no independent relationship outside of the whole. If you take the heart outside of an organism, it just decays and stops being whatever it was, right? No part of an organism exists independently outside of the organism. It just dies. You take a bone out, bones are cells, bone cells, right? It dies. It just, in order to stay what it is, it must be a part of the whole. It has no independent existence outside of that whole. So basically, this is the categorical distinctions that exist between the states of being of mechanical wholes, chemical wholes, biological wholes. Then we have that arrow coming down with the dotted line because the biological entity contains the chemical and mechanical. Mechanical relationships exist inside the biological organism. That's why reductionism can explain some aspect of the biological organism. It just can't explain the whole of it because a biological entity isn't completely mechanical. It's beyond mechanical. It also contains chemical relationships. But chemical, you can't, like, no experiment has been done where they just put the chemicals together to form a new cell. They've tried and it never can happen because the biological cell is beyond just chemicals too, although it contains them. So the biological entity contains chemical aspects and mechanical aspects, but it's beyond them. So it's not amenable to reductionism. It's a holistic entity. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So this is the point. Now this is what Kant said about the organism. This is his definition. An organism has three aspects to it. One, the parts depend on themselves. Two, the parts depend on each other. And three, the parts depend on the whole, and the whole depends on the parts. It's a reciprocal. So it's a very integrated system. So now this is getting towards the end. We're almost done here. The concept of life as a dialectical process in the Hegelian sense of concept. So concept means, for Hegel, concept is the unity of all of the content of a topic. So when we're talking about an organism, the concept of that organism includes its immature form as an embryo, the development of that form. It involves the relationships of that organism with the environment. It involves the mental capacities of that organism. So it's not just the empirically observable organism sitting in front of you. It includes its history. It includes its capacities and relationships. So it's a very comprehensive concept of what a thing is. He says that the concept of anything has three aspects of it: universal, particular, and singular. So the universal aspect of the concept is the most accommodating and indeterminate. The particular aspect of it is a little more determined, is a little bit more specified. And then finally, the singular aspects are very much determined and very specific and not so accommodating. But these three parts are working together. These are three inseparable aspects. So what does that mean for our study of an organism? So the singular aspect of the organism is maintained through its digestive activity. So we have on the left, we have that frog, right? On the blackboard there, we have a frog with a fly and a hawk. So there are three singular entities in that picture. You have a frog, you have a fly, and you have a hawk. But in order to maintain its individuality, its singularness, the frog has to take aspects of the environment that are other from it and make it itself. It will take that fly and eat the fly and digest the fly, and then the nutrients are assimilated into the different parts of the body. So it takes what is not itself and makes it into itself, and that reinforces or maintains its existence as an individual. Same thing with the hawk. The hawk, in order to maintain its own individuality, then it will eat that frog in the same way. So the digestive activity is maintaining the singular aspect of the concept of the organism. It's reinforcing its individuality. Now that particular aspect, which is a little less determined from the individual, it is reflected by the metabolic activity of the organism. So this frog, we now move to the second part of the blackboard. We have three frog-looking like creatures. The top one we can call a toad. The middle one you can call an Amazon rainforest frog. And the bottom one is just a normal frog. So there are different kinds of frogs. And the metabolic process is when it has the nutrients from that digestive activity, then it builds the body or reinforces the particular kind of body of the species of frog. It doesn't, if you're an African rainforest frog and you eat the fly, it doesn't start rebuilding you into a toad from a marsh in Europe, right? It maintains the integrity of the species of frog. So the species is a higher level than the specimen, because they're meant, all specimens, you can find 10 African rainforest frogs, and those are 10 different individuals, but they're all one singular species, right? So it's less determined in that it's more universal, it's more accommodating of many different individuals. It's a species, and in the organism that species is maintained through the metabolic activity. It maintains the particular kind of individual. And then finally, the universal is the reproductive activity. So now you have generations. You have generations of this kind of frog. And in order to maintain the integrity of that, the genus or the species of the frog, in order to keep that consistent, you need to reproduce. That's the reproductive process. So that's even more accommodating than the particular aspect, because it accommodates the generation, so the individuals across time, right? So these three aspects, singular, particular, and universal, are all necessary aspects of the concept of life. So we're talking about philosophy when we say concept, but they have physiological correspondence. This is existing as different kinds of biological activity inside the organism itself. So you can see how the conceptual and the empirical, the philosophical and the scientific, they're not separate. They're talking about the same reality, and they overlap, they correspond, they inform each other, which is what Dawkins-Noble was talking about at the end of that video. So finally, what is a dialectic process? So a self-maintained, so we'll start with the unity and diversity. You have a body, is one body, but you have many different parts of that body. The hand is a different form and a different function than the foot, which is a different form or function than the heart or the brain. So you have all this diversity, but it's still one body. When you say my body, you mean your brain, you mean your nails, you mean everything about it. So it's a unity and diversity. Simultaneously, it's one thing which is differentiated. So this helps us to think about what is, that's a dialectic. The dialectic is kind of like a contradiction that is reconciled through a higher level of understanding. So unity and diversity, they're not two opposing concepts, they are necessarily both occurring at the same time in anything that we observe. And so so in the organism, it's a self-maintained process. Everything going on in the organism is motivated from this internal purpose. That's basically how Dr. Puri ends this chapter. It's all motivated from an internal purpose. It's self-maintained. There's no external agent that has to come and act upon the organism to help it maintain itself. It's all done via the capacity of the organism as a whole. And so basically, I think the last two slides are just like a summary of the points that were discussed. Our concluding thoughts. Okay. The concept is a negative unity of its content. The organism is a negative unity of its objective content. So the objective content is the physical stuff, the molecules, the cells, organisms, tissues. And we call it a negative unity because, so first it's negative because it's negating that multiplicity for the unity of the organism. No longer is it an individual molecule or an individual cell or an individual tissue or organ. They're all aspects or moments of that whole. So it's negating that diversity as a unity. But that doesn't mean that diversity is annihilated. It means that the diversity is essential to the existence of the unity, but it's being negated. It's implicit. And the unity of the organism is explicit. But they're existing at the same time, but one is implicit, one is explicit. And it's also a subjective unity. There's a qualitative shift that occurs because the objective stuff is being utilized for the subjective purposes of that entity. That entity is trying to fulfill its desires, to survive, to reproduce, to have pleasure, to learn, to engage in spiritual activities as a human being and experience that kind of development. Those are all subjective ends that the objective constituents of the organism are operating to fulfill and to support. So it's a qualitative shift from the objective to the subject. And again, they're not opposed to each other. They're directly related to each other, but in a negative sense. One becomes implicit, the objective becomes implicit to the explicit subjective aspect of the goals of that individual, of the decisions of that individual. Okay, so the second concluding thought of what we discussed in the beginning. Natural laws act as an external agency on natural objects, as biological objects which possess internal purpose can resist laws like gravity and thermodynamics. We talked about that already. And then finally, the difference between organisms and machines. So that's like the most simplistic takeaway from this whole presentation, right? This discussion between organisms and machines. Are they the same? We're saying no, absolutely not. They're not the same thing. Organisms do possess mechanical aspects to them, no doubt, but they are beyond mechanical aspects. So any kind of medical approach, scientific approach, philosophical approach that tries to treat an organism as a machine will simply be incomplete. You don't have to say any kind of mean or cruel words about it. It simply will be incomplete. It will give you some idea of the organism, but not the entire idea. So we're trying to advocate studying that more comprehensive, more conceptual aspect of the organism that moves beyond the mere mechanistic idea. And we are finished. This is just a summary of the 10 points.
I loved that.
Thank you very much.
Of course. Yeah, that was fantastic. I'm excited for the next meeting. I tell my friends, I don't have a lot of friends, but.
Hopefully you can consider us among them then.
Of course. Actually, I was talking to a friend about the word friend, and I think we use it very lightly.